The man known to history as Friedrich Engels was born on the 28th of November 1820 in the town of Barmen, on the banks of the river Wupper, which was then among the possessions of the Kingdom of Prussia in the Rhineland in western Germany. The town was later amalgamated into the city of Wuppertal in the 20th century. Engels came from a family of prosperous businessmen in the textiles industry. His father, also called Friedrich Engels, was the grandson of Johann Caspar Engels I, an entrepreneur who built up a successful linen bleaching business under the name Caspar Engels und Sohne. Born in 1796, Friedrich Engels Sr. worked for the family business. After the death of his father, Johann Caspar Engels II, in 1821, he and his brothers were engaged in a lengthy dispute over the inheritance of the business until 1837, when Friedrich Sr. went into business with the Dutch Barmen brothers and established cotton mills in Manchester, Barmen, and nearby Engelskirchen. Although Friedrich Sr. had a reputation for unsentimental profiteering and a shrewd business acumen, combined with an austere religious puritanism, he was also an amateur musician who could play several instruments and enjoyed family concerts. In 1819, Friedrich Sr. married Elisabeth von Haar, known to the family as Elise. She came from a family of clerics and scholars from the nearby town of Hamm. The couple would have 8 children in all, 4 sons and 4 daughters, of whom Friedrich Jr. was the eldest. Owing to her family's intellectual background, Elise encouraged her son Friedrich's interest in literature and classical mythology. While Friedrich would later break off relations with his namesake father, he remained close to his mother throughout her life. Friedrich Engels was born at a time of political and industrial revolution across Europe. The French Revolution of 1789 saw the adoption of a radical liberal doctrine of universal human rights in France, though it soon descended into bloodshed and terror in the early 1790s. Napoleon Bonaparte's subsequent seizure of power in 1799 as First Consul of France and later as Emperor of the French restored a sense of stability in France, while his efforts to forge a continent-wide French empire ended in defeat in 1815. Among the factors in Napoleon's defeat in the Napoleonic Wars was the economic superiority of Britain, whose Royal Navy controlled global maritime trade and the economy of which was the first to industrialize during the second half of the 18th century. France's defeat and the growing prosperity of Britain highlighted the great benefits of industrialization, and soon the continental powers of Europe were seeking to emulate the British example. The Engels family were among the industrial pioneers in the Rhineland, which would become the industrial powerhouse of Germany during the 19th century, and in 1775, Friedrich's great-grandfather introduced mechanical lace-making processes to the region. At the time of Friedrich Jr.'s birth, the population of his native Barmen was around 16,000 people, a figure which increased to 40,000 2 decades later, as the town acquired the reputation of being the German Manchester. Still, all of this industrialization brought problems too, in the shape of a growing urban working class, mired in poverty and working draconian hours, sometimes as much as 60 to 70 hours a week. The Engels factory was among the few enterprises in the region that did not employ child labor, and the family also pursued philanthropic initiatives to support poorer members of society. Little is known about Friedrich Jr.'s early childhood, though he and his siblings spent most of it with their mother, as Friedrich Sr. was preoccupied with managing his business interests. In 1828, Friedrich began attending the local elementary school in Barmen. Although he later criticized his teachers for being conservative and unimaginative, he enjoyed his lessons in chemistry and physics, which inspired a lifelong interest in science. At the age of 14, he was sent to the gymnasium or grammar school at Elberfeld, where he boarded with the headmaster, Dr. Hanschke. Engels claimed that the school was considered one of the best in Prussia, and he received a liberal education that included a range of sciences, several ancient and modern languages, as well as history and religion. Friedrich excelled at languages and was introduced to the philosophers of the 18th century Enlightenment who championed human reason in place of religious superstition. Engels was also interested in German folklore and history, which inspired the romantic patriotism of Johann Gottlieb von Herder and Johann Gottlieb Fichte. Although the conservative Prussian monarchy had acquired the Rhineland following the Napoleonic Wars, a liberal German patriotic movement continued to be influential until 1819, when Prince Clemens von Metternich, the powerful chancellor of the Austrian Empire, adopted the Karlsbad decrees to close down liberal student societies and restrict press freedoms. These Austrian measures were quickly adopted across the lands of the German Confederation, including the Kingdom of Prussia. At Elberfeld, the teenage Engels wrote poetry and essays praising the liberal tradition. These views were at odds with his father, and in 1837, Engels was withdrawn from the gymnasium against his wishes. Instead of being allowed to pursue his passions, Friedrich was introduced to the textile business. In 1838, father and son went to England to inspect Ehrman and Engels' operation in Manchester. On the way back, they stopped off at the historic port city of Bremen, where young Friedrich was apprenticed to the linen merchant Heinrich Leupold. As a clerk in the trading house, Engels handled international transactions and acquired an understanding of global capitalism in the form of exchange rates, import duties, and profit margins. While there, Engels was also influenced by the radical politics of Junges Deutschland, or Young Germany, a left-wing nationalist organization that rejected the romantic nostalgia for medieval Germany in favor of a forward-looking, democratic Germany, characterized by religious freedom and the abolition of aristocratic privilege. In 1839, Engels wrote his first published work, a poem called The Bedouin, in which he lamented that this once proud Arab people were reduced to performing in the Parisian circus. In addition to these poetic ventures, Engels wrote essays for the journal Telegraph für Deutschland under the pseudonym Friedrich Oswald to avoid associating the respectable Engels family name with his increasingly radical political views, which were interspersed among pieces of literary criticism and travelogues to avoid censorship. During the 1830s, as the textile industry in Barmen began to suffer from competition from not just England, but also new producers in Belgium, France, Austria, and other regions, profits fell and working conditions deteriorated. In 1839, Engels published a set of letters from Wuppertal, highlighting the demoralized, exploited, and often excessively drunken condition of the working population, as many people used growing amounts of alcohol to anesthetize the aches, pains, and psychological pain of working long hours in factories and mines. In his attack on Wuppertal's employers, Engels highlighted the hypocrisy of men who were keen to broadcast their supposed religious devotion to the wider community, while being the worst exploiters of the poorer sections of those communities at the very same time. Such sentiments reflected Engels' own rejection of the dogmatic Protestantism that he had inherited from his father. After he was introduced to David Friedrich Strauss's Life of Jesus, which approached the Bible not as the Word of God, but as a product of its historical context, Engels definitively broke from the Christian faith. Instead, Engels soon embraced the philosophy of Georg Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel, a German philosopher who had only recently died in 1831, and some of whose work was still being published posthumously for the first time in the 1830s and 1840s. Hegel saw historical progress driven by the spirit or self-conscious human reason. While Hegel did not entirely reject the idea of God, he saw God and man as being on a shared path to freedom and progress, rejecting man's subservience to God. In 1841, as part of his year of mandatory military service in the Prussian Guards artillery, Engels settled in Berlin. In addition to donning a Prussian artilleryman's uniform and taking part in military drills, Engels spent his free time attending lectures at the city's university, known today as the Humboldt University. Hegel had served as chair of philosophy there from 1818 until his death in 1831. While Hegel's emphasis on the state as one of the main drivers of historical development was embraced by Prussian conservatives, Hegel's more radical protégés harnessed the Hegelian dialectic, the concept of deploying an opposed thesis and antithesis in an argument before arriving at a synthesis of the two, to explain the progression of history. In this, it was claimed that each historical era was defined by a prevailing social and political orthodoxy, which was then challenged, ultimately resulting in a political synthesis. For instance, the French Revolution had begun with the orthodoxy of the Ancien Régime and monarchical absolutism. This was then challenged by an antithetical system of radical liberalism through the French Revolution of 1789, before a synthesis of the two systems emerged in the early 19th century, specifically a French monarchy with democratic elements and shorn of the absolutism of the 17th and 18th centuries. Young Hegelians were inspired by this approach to political development to offer a liberal challenge to the conservatism of the Prussians. Engels would spend many evenings discussing philosophical questions in Berlin alehouses with a group of like-minded academics and journalists who gathered around the philosopher Bruno Bauer, a former student of Hegel's. In October 1842, Engels' year of national service was complete, and he returned to Barmen. Dismayed by his son's increasing radicalism, Friedrich Engels Sr. resolved to send him to Manchester as general assistant at the Ehrmann and Engels mill there. On his way to England in November 1842, Engels visited the offices of the Rheinische Zeitung newspaper in Cologne, where he met its new editor, Karl Marx, for the first time. Born in Trier in Western Germany in 1818, to a Jewish family that had recently converted to Lutheranism, Marx initially studied law at the University of Bonn before transferring to philosophy at the University of Berlin, where he joined the young Hegelian movement. Since his anti-religious thesis was too controversial for conservative Berlin, Marx left the Prussian capital in 1841, a few months before Engels' arrival, and received his doctorate from the University of Jena. In 1842, he began writing for the newly established Rheinische Zeitung and immediately revived the fortunes of the struggling paper after becoming its editor. Engels had already contributed to the Rheinische Zeitung. The pair's political, philosophical, and social views would gradually become more and more aligned over the next several years, notably in that both Marx and Engels soon grew to disagree with some of the orthodoxies of Hegelian thought. They would also, within a few years, form one of the most significant intellectual partnerships of the 19th century. When Engels arrived there in December 1842, Manchester was a city of over 300,000 people at the heart of Britain's textiles industry. The French political scientist Alexis de Tocqueville, fresh from publishing his landmark 2-volume study, Democracy in America, had described Manchester as a new Hades, covered in black smoke emanating from a forest of chimneys, where one cannot escape the, quote, crunching wheel of machinery, or the noise of the furnaces. Although he had made a couple of brief visits to the city before, Engels was shocked at the level of poverty and destitution he encountered. A few months earlier, Manchester experienced the Plug Plot riots, as a series of strikes broke out across the country in August 1842, after the political authorities in London rejected working-class demands for universal male suffrage and labour reforms. Engels worked at the Victoria Mill in Salford, across the River Irwell from Manchester. He attended meetings at the Owenite Hall of Science, an institution founded by followers of the agrarian socialist Robert Owen, who inspired the creation of cooperatives around the country. Engels also established relations with the Chartist movement, a group lobbying for universal male suffrage and annual elections. While Engels was sympathetic to working-class Chartism, he did not believe that reforms within the existing social and political system were sufficient for the emancipation of the English working class. In his critique of industrial capitalism, Engels was influenced by the writings of Thomas Carlyle, who reckoned that the life of a factory worker was worse than that of a medieval serf. Among Engels' guides to the working-class areas of Manchester was Mary Burns, a young woman of Irish extraction in her early 20s. She may have been a domestic servant or a factory worker when she met Engels in early 1843. The two soon became romantic partners and would live together for the next 20 years, though both considered marriage as an oppressive bourgeois institution. Mary introduced Engels to the Irish immigrant community in Manchester, who lived in the most deprived areas of the city, areas that someone like Engels from an upper-class background would rarely have set foot in during the 19th century. Here, Mary provided Engels with an invaluable insight into the condition of the working class that influenced his thinking. Having recognized that German socialist and communist thought had been too theoretical, in 1843 Engels wrote an article entitled Outlines of a Critique of Political Economy for the Deutsche Französische Jahrbücher, Marx's new paper, in which he carried out an empirical analysis of Britain's capitalist political economy, arguing that private property had led to the alienation of man from his natural essence and transformed him into a slave to material goods. For Engels, the abolition of private property would bring forth communism, an emerging political idea in the 1840s, one which favoured the creation of a new utopian society in which industrial businesses would be taken over by collective or communal groups of workers. In this way, the average worker would move from being an oppressed individual whose labor was exploited by the bourgeois capitalists to someone in charge of his own destiny. Engels developed these ideas into a series of articles which were then collected into one of his most famous books, The Condition of the Working Class in England, published in German in 1845. Citing not only his first-hand experience of the Manchester slums, but also government records and articles from liberal bourgeoisie newspapers, Engels declared, quote, "I accuse the English bourgeois before the entire world of murder, robbery, and other crimes on a massive scale." While writing about England, he was also issuing a warning to the German bourgeoisie, as he believed that the social crisis that he was witnessing in England would soon spread to the continent. Despite having Mary Burns as his guide, Engels could not avoid stereotyping the Irishman as, quote, "a carefree, cheerful, potato-eating child of nature, wholly unsuited to slaving away in Manchester's factories, and whose only response to his wretched existence was to turn to drink." Engels observed that the dreadful conditions which the Irish endured also served to drive down wages for other workers, leading to widespread poverty. Describing the constant surveillance of factory workers by managers, and the practice of moving the clocks forward by a quarter of an hour so that workers would lose several hours of pay when they arrived for work, Engels concluded that the existence of the English working classes was worse than African slaves in North America. In subsequent sections of his work, Engels observed that the industrial city of Manchester had been purposely built to separate the urban proletariat of poor workers from the capitalist bourgeoisie, a radical departure from his native Barmen, where owners and workers lived in close proximity to each other. While the city of Manchester was home to attractive shops and warehouses, and served as a location for business transactions, it was surrounded by high-density working-class districts, crisscrossed by a rabbit warren of alleyways. The more affluent inhabitants lived further out in neighborhoods ordered by regular street patterns, while the wealthiest lived in villas among the surrounding countryside, free from the dirty air. Most ingeniously, the wealthier districts were connected to the center via straight roads lined with respectable shops, so they could travel to the commercial district without witnessing the penury of the working-class slums. Yet, Engels believed that the careful urban zoning carried out by the bourgeoisie to separate themselves from the working classes also created the conditions for the workers to coalesce and develop a sense of class consciousness. This offered the possibility of a class-conscious proletariat soon rising up in response to these poor conditions. Engels saw the clash between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie as the next stage of historical development, leading to the destruction of the big industrial cities in favor of the fusion of town and country. The Condition of the Working Class in England was largely written and compiled in Germany, as Engels left Manchester and returned to Barmen in the summer of 1844. On his way back, he met with Karl Marx in Paris on the 28th of August. Since their previous meeting, Marx had moved to Paris after the Rheinische Zeitung was closed down by the Prussian authorities following a complaint by Tsar Nicholas I of Russia about the paper's commentary on the cause of Polish nationalism, Poland then being largely subsumed within the Kingdom of Prussia and the Russian Empire. Marx was impressed by Engels' writings on the capitalist economy, and the two men now became close ideological allies. As a result of this second meeting, they would become lifelong friends and collaborators, launching a famous partnership that would last for the next 4 decades. The two men had taken independent paths to arrive at the same ideological destination, and during their long collaboration, Engels was content to allow Marx to take the lead in establishing the ideological basis of their philosophy, though he played an important role in structuring Marx's thoughts. Their first collaboration was a brief attack on Bruno Bauer and the young Hegelians under the satirical title The Holy Family, which denounced their obsession with the metaphysical Hegelian spirit without acknowledging the role of material wealth and property in determining social structures. On his journey from Paris to Barmen, Engels was excited to see the spread of socialist and communist sentiment in the Rhineland. In early 1845, he and the Jewish-German philosopher and social commentator Moses Hess organized a series of meetings about communism among the local bourgeoisie. Engels built on a theme that he had first set out in Outlines of a Critique of Political Economy, arguing that capitalist competition would eventually lead to a society composed of a small number of immensely wealthy individuals and a mass of destitute workers with nobody in between, building up pressure for a more equitable distribution of wealth. Engels argued that a communist system would be more productive, eliminating the waste of resources expended in competing for the same objective in favor of the efficient allocation of resources where they are required, while technological innovation could be harnessed for the public good. Engels reassured his conservative audience that communism would be brought about not by violent revolution, but by paternalistic persuasion. Engels won over a handful of converts during each meeting, but his activities brought him to the attention of the authorities, causing great embarrassment to his father, who cut him off from his allowance. This fraught relationship between Friedrich and the rest of the family would prevail for virtually his entire adult life. In the meantime, Marx had been forced to leave Paris for Brussels after fresh complaints about his actions in the French capital. In the spring of 1845, Engels joined him in the Belgian capital. The two friends made a brief trip to England to visit the city's slums and study economic data at Manchester's Cheetham Library. Engels re-established contact with Mary Burns, who joined them when they returned to Belgium in late summer. In Brussels, Marx and Engels lived with their respective partners in neighboring apartments. The two men embarked on their next collaboration, entitled The German Ideology. Although never published in their lifetimes, the book was a key step in the development of their theory of historical materialism, a doctrine which held that historical change was dictated by the transformation from one mode of social organization to another, as determined by economic and technological factors, rather than the actions of nation-states and their rulers, which was the more traditional view of historical causation at the time. Marx and Engels observed that each stage of social transformation was fiercely resisted by the ruling elites, and that only a revolution would bring about a new form of social organization. Such a revolution did not necessarily have to be violent. Marx and Engels believed the establishment of democracy through universal suffrage would eventually bring about communism in a relatively peaceful manner. In line with this view, in 1846, Marx and Engels formed the Communist Correspondence Committee to coordinate the activities of European socialists. From its inception, there was a dogmatic quality to it, with Marx and Engels attempting to impose ideological uniformity on the members of the Correspondence Committee. In this spirit, Engels went to Paris in August 1846 to take on the supporters of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, the French philosopher whose 1840 treatise, What is Property?, had influenced Marx and Engels' belief that the very concept of private property was causing a lot of industrial society's problems. Still, Proudhon's prescriptions of socialist cooperation were deemed too idealistic. In June 1847, Engels attended the Congress of the League of the Just in London as its representative from Paris, during which the organization changed its name to the Communist League and adopted the slogan, "Working men of all countries, unite." Engels was tasked with drafting a statement of the League's aims, which initially took the form of a catechism entitled Draft of a Communist Confession of Faith, in which he declared that the aim of communism was to organize society in such a way that every member of it can develop and use all his capabilities and powers in complete freedom and without thereby infringing the basic conditions of this society. Although the text contained much of Marx and Engels' ideas about the proletariat as the vanguard of the socialist revolution, Engels had been forced to compromise with the utopian socialists and, in October, produced a second draft, The Principles of Communism. The Principles had been produced in advance of a second conference in London, which began in late November. On this occasion, Marx was in attendance, and he and Engels ensured that the principles were adopted unanimously. The two men were then asked to write a manifesto on the basis of these principles. First in London and later in Brussels, Marx and Engels worked on what would become the Communist Manifesto, one of the most influential works of political theory in history. The Communist Manifesto owed much to Engels' observations of the English proletariat in Manchester, which served as the basis for the description of the global proletariat, described as, quote, "a class of labourers who live only so long as they find work, and who find work only so long as their labour increases capital." Marx and Engels cast aside their Hegelian baggage by declaring that the history of all hitherto existing class society is the history of class struggles, ultimately leading to the proletarian revolution. Nevertheless, Marx's literary style came to the fore in his description of the rapid industrial and social development brought about by the bourgeoisie, claiming that the bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society, with the consequence that all that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face, with sober sense, his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. The text went on to articulate how a communist society should be created. Although the text of the Communist Manifesto was the result of considerable intellectual exchange between Marx and Engels, going back to 1843, the treatise was largely authored by Marx, not Engels, though both their names would appear on the cover when it was published in London, late in February 1848. Despite its later influence, the Communist Manifesto had virtually no impact among wider society when it was first published. Instead, Marx and Engels were overtaken by revolution on the streets of Paris and a great many other European capitals. On the 24th of February 1848, the increasingly autocratic King Louis-Philippe I was overthrown and the Second French Republic established in his place in France. The bourgeois democratic revolution predicted by Marx and Engels appeared to be underway, and the two men were keen to play their part. In order to evade attempts by the European monarchies to arrest them as part of wider reactionary crackdowns on political dissidents, they left Brussels and arrived at Paris in early March. The events in Paris inspired demonstrations in Vienna, which led to the resignation of Metternich in March, alongside nationalist uprisings in northern Italy against Austrian rule. By mid-March, the revolution had reached Prussia, where King Friedrich William IV was compelled to make liberal concessions in order to keep a hold of his throne. Marx and Engels decided to set up their base in the city of Cologne, where Marx resurrected his old newspaper as the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, calling for a united front between the workers and elements of the bourgeoisie. Engels was sent to Barmen to raise money from his relatives, but came back empty-handed. The honeymoon of the revolutions of 1848 did not last long, and by summer the forces of conservatism and reaction regained the initiative. Making some concessions to buy off the liberal bourgeoisie, the ruling classes in places like Germany and Austria isolated the radicals and employed military force to re-establish their authority. By September 1848, Engels was on the run and returned to Paris, from where he embarked on a long journey to Bern in Switzerland. He took a great interest in events in Hungary, where the nationalist leader Lajos Kossuth had taken control of the Diet in Budapest and established a government independent of the Austrian Empire. Kossuth's Hungarian nationalism was opposed by Slavic minorities, who allied with the Austrian army to defeat the Hungarians, while the government in Vienna was also allied with the Russian Empire in crushing nationalist movements in Eastern and Central Europe. Inspired by Kossuth, Engels was determined to return to Germany to fight a guerrilla war against the Prussian authorities and returned to Cologne in January 1849. In March, a National Assembly in Frankfurt adopted a liberal imperial constitution for a united Germany and invited King Friedrich William IV to be its emperor. The Prussian king's refusal to accept a crown from a popular assembly sparked further risings against Prussian authority, and in May 1849, the workers of Elberfeld formed a revolutionary militia. Engels was appointed to organize the town's defenses, but by replacing the German black-red-gold tricolour with the red flag of communism, he alarmed his compatriots and was soon ordered to leave. As the Prussian armies cracked down on insurgents, Engels joined rebel leader August Willich in Baden in southwestern Germany, where he took part in a battle that constituted a valiant but forlorn effort to prevent the last pockets of revolutionary resistance from being eliminated by the Prussian army. Engels retreated to Switzerland in the aftermath of the failed revolution. There he wrote an account of his experiences in The Campaign for the German Imperial Constitution, attacking the petite bourgeoisie for abandoning the workers. The experience of 1848 prompted Marx and Engels to rethink their strategy. After shutting down the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, Marx had briefly moved to Paris, but the increasingly dictatorial French government under Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the future Emperor Napoleon III, forced him into exile in London. Engels soon joined him there, and the pair would base themselves out of Britain for decades to come. In the aftermath of 1848, Marx and Engels were caught up in the recriminations over the failure of the revolution in a country that harbored revolutionary exiles from all over the continent. True to form, the pair left old comrades behind as their ideology evolved. Rather than a two-stage revolution, in which they saw the proletariat working hand in hand with the petty bourgeoisie to achieve gradual social and political change, Engels and Marx now believed that the proletariat had to walk its own path in an effort to defeat the remnants of the feudal order and the prevailing capitalist order to attain socialism and communism. In addition to their political struggles, neither Marx nor Engels had much money after relocating to England at the end of the 1840s. This situation forced a reluctant Engels to return to work for the family business in Manchester. The Manchester of the early 1850s had changed considerably from Engels' experience of the city a few years earlier. The repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 to reduce the price of grain represented the triumph of liberalism over both aristocratic conservatism and Chartism, and while there had been some unrest in Britain in 1848, it was muted by comparison with what occurred on the continent. These developments caused Engels to lament that England was now home to both a bourgeois aristocracy and a bourgeois proletariat. During the 1850s, the British cotton industry experienced a boom thanks to the opening of new markets in the Americas, Australia, and China via the steamships that had proliferated since the late 1830s. Ehrman and Engels' cotton sewing thread was consequently in high demand. Among Engels' tasks was to audit the company's books to ensure that his father's business partners were not undermining his interests by running side businesses. To his father's surprise, Engels conducted a thorough investigation into the company's finances, and a reconciliation of sorts between the pair occurred in 1851. Engels was subsequently granted a 7.5% share of the company's profits, what amounted to the equivalent of a six-figure salary in modern monetary terms. While Engels struggled with the uncomfortable reality that he was making money through what he perceived as exploitation of the proletariat, he consoled himself with the knowledge that he was supporting the revolutionary cause by financing Marx, often sending half his annual salary to Karl in London. Marx and Engels believed that a precondition of socialist revolution was an economic collapse that would create a vast pool of unemployed workers ready to lead the revolution. From his managerial post, Engels had an insight into the health of the global markets, but with every downturn, the English working class failed to stir. Marx and Engels had high hopes when the American Civil War badly damaged the British cotton industry in the early 1860s. This led to a decline in raw cotton from Virginia and the Carolinas for British factories to spin into processed textiles. However, British textile workers stoically endured the economic downturn, and there was no major unrest in cities like Manchester as the Civil War raged across the Atlantic between 1861 and 1865. With all quiet on the revolutionary front, Engels encouraged Marx to continue working on his extensive analysis of capitalism that would eventually become his magnum opus, Das Kapital. Marx and Engels carried on an almost daily correspondence, and the former called on the latter to provide empirical data from the factories of Manchester to support his theoretical arguments. Engels' greatest sacrifice for Marx possibly had nothing to do with money or revolutionary theory, but Marx's personal life. During these years, Engels unofficially acknowledged paternity of Henry Frederick de Muth, a boy Marx had possibly fathered with his housekeeper Helena de Muth in 1851, during a period when Karl's wife was away from London. Marx's family was confused by Engels' dismissive attitude to young Freddie. It was only after Engels' own death, many decades later, that some of them began to suspect that Demuth was actually Karl's son, though this remains an issue of some controversy, and many biographers of both Marx and Engels are not agreed that Demuth was in fact a son of Marx. What is clear is that Engels was living a kind of double life as well in Manchester. As a factory manager, he sought to disguise his relationship with Mary Burns, his long-term partner, though they had never married, an unusual arrangement in 19th century Europe. While keeping an official residence to maintain respectability, Engels spent much of his time living in a home which Mary lived in. From the late 1850s, Engels became a member of the prestigious Cheshire Hunt, riding alongside some of the country's most prominent aristocrats. Engels was also a leading representative of the German émigré community and a member of several exclusive private members' clubs. The stress of living his double life, combined with Marx's incessant demands for money and articles, resulted in a bout of glandular fever in 1857, and his health suffered further following his father's death in 1860, which led to an attempt by the Ehrman brothers to force him out of the company. Despite all of this, Engels found time to contribute to the revolutionary cause by further developing the theory of historical materialism first set out in The German Ideology. For Marx and Engels, history was not determined by great men, but by socio-economic forces outside their control. In Marx's words, quote, "Men make their history, but they do not make it just as they please." In 1850, Engels had written The Peasant War in Germany, an analysis of a peasant uprising in southern Germany in the mid-1520s, inspired by the Protestant Reformation. The radical uprising had eventually been defeated. Engels drew parallels between the experiences of the German peasants of the Reformation era and the manner in which the revolutionaries of 1848 had been betrayed by the bourgeoisie. Then, in the late 1850s, with tensions growing between France, Austria, and Prussia over the prospect of Italian unification, Engels anonymously published Po and Rhine, an astute analysis of Prussia's position, which was so highly praised on the continent that it was believed to have been written by a Prussian general. Not everything was smooth sailing during these years, though. In 1863, Engels suffered a major blow in his personal life with the unexpected death of his partner, Mary Burns, in her early 40s. Engels was appalled when Marx responded to the news by complaining about his own problems and asking for money. But their friendship survived after Marx sent an apologetic letter. In the aftermath of Mary's death, Engels grew closer to her sister Lizzie, and they would eventually, after many years together, marry in 1878. As a result of his connections with the Burns sisters, Engels took a greater interest in Ireland during these years and planned to write a history of the island which would explore its position as England's first colony and the revolutionary movement there over the centuries. The project was never realized, though. In 1867, after 17 years of work, Marx had completed the manuscript of Volume 1 of Das Kapital, rewriting and editing significant parts following feedback from Engels. This, not the Communist Manifesto, was Marx's foremost work, an enormous text when the 3 volumes of it were eventually finished, one that outlined Marx's entire philosophical and political system, and his view of the materialist development of human history. One of the key ideas in Das Kapital was Marx's theory of surplus value, in which he argued that every hour of production over and above the amount necessary for a worker to make a living was expropriated by the factory owner as profit. In more graphic terms, Marx argued emotively of the factory owners that, quote, "they mutilate the laborer into a fragment of man, degrade him to the level of an appendage of a machine, destroy every remnant of charm in his work, and turn it into a hated toil." The irony, of course, was that it would not have been possible for Marx to complete Das Kapital had it not been for the financial support which Engels had provided over the years, much of which ultimately derived from his holdings in and work for the Barmen and Engels factory. Following the publication of Das Kapital in September 1867, Engels set about publicizing the book by reaching out to contacts in Europe and America. In 1869, Engels' contract with the Barmen and Engels firm came to an end, and neither Engels nor Gottfried Barmen was keen on continuing the partnership. Anxious to get away from it all, Engels settled for a severance payment of £12,000, enough to sustain him and Marx for many years to come. Nevertheless, the often contradictory nature of Engels' activities continued, and during the 1870s he invested much of this severance payment in the stock market to bolster his fortune. At the age of 49, he felt newly liberated, and in the summer of 1870 he and Lizzie moved to London, keen to re-enter the world of revolutionary politics. Engels was immediately elected to the International Working Men's Association, also known as the First International, a communist and radical socialist organization that had been founded in 1864. Engels was elected corresponding secretary to most European revolutionary parties, while his linguistic skills also led him to supervise the translation of his and Marx's work into a host of European languages. Engels' home at 122 Regent's Park Road soon began to attract communists from all over Europe, speaking a variety of tongues. Marx lived 10 minutes away to the north at Maitland Park Road, and Engels would visit his friend daily to exchange their latest thoughts. During this time, Marx continued to work on additional volumes of Das Kapital, while Engels pursued his own writing projects. Engels' arrival at London coincided with monumental events in continental Europe. During the 1860s, Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck had set out to unite Germany by force. In 1864, the Prussian army led a German coalition to conquer the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein from Denmark, and in 1866, Prussia defeated Austria to consolidate its leading position in Germany. Feeling threatened by Prussian militarism, in 1870, Emperor Napoleon III of France declared war on Prussia, after being provoked into doing so by Bismarck over a dispute regarding the succession to the throne of Spain. Thanks to Marx's connections, Engels was able to secure a role as a correspondent for the Pall Mall Gazette during the short Franco-Prussian War that followed. Through the cousin of a friend who served with the Germans, Engels was provided with details of the movements of the Prussian army, and he predicted Napoleon's defeat and capture at the Battle of Sedan on the 2nd of September 1870, earning the nickname the General from Marx. Though Marx and Engels sympathized with the Prussian cause and welcomed both the unification of Germany and the fall of the Bonapartist regime, Bismarck's demands to annex France's eastern provinces of Alsace and Lorraine prolonged the war and led to a brutal siege of Paris. Soon after the Prussians left Paris, the Parisian workers took control of the city in March 1871 and declared the establishment of the Paris Commune. a short-lived revolutionary government that was brutally suppressed by the French Third Republic in May. It is often perceived as the first effort at establishing a communist government anywhere in Europe. Meanwhile, the Franco-Prussian War had led to the creation of a German empire under Prussian domination. Marx and Engels argued that the Paris Commune had failed due to a lack of revolutionary organization and discipline, a theme that Engels returned to in his quest to undermine Mikhail Bakunin, the Russian anarchist who espoused individual freedom and saw Marxism as a recipe for authoritarianism. Although Marx and Engels successfully managed to expel Bakunin from the First International in 1872, political infighting fatally undermined the organization, which disbanded in 1876 after losing its momentum in the years after the Hague Conference of 1872. Despite its demise, Engels continued to liaise with Wilhelm Liebknecht and August Bebel's Social Democratic Workers' Party of Germany. The German socialists experienced a surge in popularity after Bismarck cracked down on left-wing party organizations in 1878 and won 12 seats in the Reichstag in the 1881 elections. From his headquarters in London, Engels wrote extensively about political developments in the new German Empire. He also took a close interest in the revolutionary movement in Russia, which was divided between the orthodox Marxism of Georgy Plekhanov and the populism of Nikolai Chernyshevsky, who saw Russian peasant communes as the model for revolutionary socialism. Although he briefly endorsed the peasant commune as the means to overthrow the hated Tsarist autocracy, Engels ultimately saw it as a conservative and reactionary institution. Few people believed at the time that communism could ultimately take root in a largely agricultural society like Russia that had only experienced limited industrialization. Aside from the task of promoting ideological unity among global communists, Engels turned his attention to the physical sciences. In Manchester, Engels had witnessed significant scientific and technological breakthroughs, and he and Marx both admired Darwin's On the Origin of Species, linking the theory of evolution and the struggle for survival to the class struggle in human society. As he and Marx had done with history, Engels sought to apply Hegelian dialectics to the natural sciences. Between 1872 and 1883, he worked on a series of essays which were eventually compiled into Dialectics of Nature and published in 1927, following a recommendation from Albert Einstein. In his essay, The Part Played by Labor in the Transition from Ape to Man, Engels theorized that the development of opposable thumbs, resulting in the ability to make tools, enabled human beings to gain mastery over nature, and that the demands of labor led to the formation of human societies and systems of mutual support, which in turn produced human speech and supported the development of the human brain. According to Engels, labor represented the basic condition of human existence and separated humans from animals. While this theory of the development of the human brain has subsequently been widely accepted by evolutionary biologists, Engels' scientific framework of dialectical materialism unwittingly turned science into an ideological battleground for 20th century communist regimes, leading to the rejection and persecution of scientists who adopted alternative scientific approaches. During the 1870s and 1880s, Engels also began to produce a series of pamphlets aimed at providing a concise introduction to Marx's thought for those without the time or inclination to read the cumbersome first volume of Das Kapital. The most influential of these was Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, published in French in 1880. Engels distinguished between Marx's scientific socialism as the natural successor to capitalism and the utopian socialism of other German thinkers of the time, the latter of which were deemed unrealistic in their idealism. According to Engels, once capitalism had collapsed as a result of its internal contradictions, the proletariat would seize political power and abolish all class distinctions. Under communism, the state would become superfluous and wither away, leading to the ultimate liberation of mankind. Beyond this, Engels enjoyed a semi-retirement from the mid-1870s onwards, relieved of his responsibilities as a company manager and of helping to run the now-defunct First International. He enjoyed spending time by the seaside with Lizzie and the Marx family. The sea air benefited the asthmatic Lizzie's fragile health, but she was also suffering from bladder cancer. Unlike her late sister Mary, Lizzie had retained her Catholic faith and wished to sanctify her relationship with Engels before her demise. On the 11th of September 1878, Engels summoned a nearby Anglican priest to conduct a marriage ceremony at Lizzie's bedside several hours before her death. Karl and Jenny Marx were also in increasingly poor health, and Karl was too ill to attend to Jenny when she died in November 1881. Marx lingered on for more than a year. Engels continued to visit his friend daily. He had just arrived at Marx's house on the afternoon of the 14th of March, 1883, when he died at the age of 64. Engels was one of only 11 mourners in attendance when Marx was buried alongside Jenny in Highgate Cemetery. In his eulogy, Engels declared that he was mourned by millions of revolutionary fellow workers from the mines of Siberia to California. Engels dedicated the remainder of his life to protecting and promoting Marx's work. As Marx's literary executor, Engels not only had to sift his way through Marx's drafts, but was caught in a power struggle between Marx's surviving daughters, Laura and Eleanor. In addition to supervising the translation of Marx's published works, Engels faced a monumental task in preparing the unfinished drafts of the second and third volumes of Das Kapital for publication. He was disappointed to find that Marx had been distracted from developing his arguments by collecting reams of data on the American and Russian economies. 2 years after Marx's death, Volume 2 of Das Kapital was published in German in May 1885. The third volume proved a tougher challenge, and in the interests of clarifying the line of argument, Engels allowed himself extensive editorial freedom to restructure Marx's text and introduce his own material. Thus, it was not until 1894 that Volume 3 saw the light of day, and it bore Engels' imprint more than the first 2 volumes. Among Marx's papers, Engels found a summary of a study by the American anthropologist Lewis Morgan into the transformation from tribal societies to modern civilization, which focused on the Iroquois tribal confederacy and described the change from a system of social organization of shared property and sexual partners to one of a monogamous family unit. Engels was keen to apply historical materialism to Morgan's work, and in 1884 he produced The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, in light of the researches by Lewis H. Morgan. In August 1888, at the age of 68, Engels made a visit to North America. He had high hopes for the American labor movement, which was organizing a series of strikes in response to an era of capitalist excess known as the Gilded Age. Rather than address large crowds of striking workers, Engels preferred to travel incognito from New York to Boston before returning via Canada. Although the blinding electric lighting and ubiquitous advertising in New York City gave Engels a glimpse of the future of capitalism, the trip had a revitalizing impact. Back in England, Engels sensed that the docile British working classes were at last stirring, and he joined 200,000 socialists in the inaugural May Day parade through the streets of London on the 4th of May 1890. However, the socialist revival of the 1890s was led by bourgeois intellectuals, such as the designer William Morris and the writer George Bernard Shaw, neither of whom had much interest or understanding of communist ideas. In a demonstration of loyalty to the Marx family, Engels supported Edward Aveling, Eleanor Marx's bigamous husband, whose womanizing and misappropriation of party funds was partly offset by his efforts to organize the British working classes in London's East End. Engels' favour towards Aveling gradually alienated him from the British Labour movement, which coalesced behind Keir Hardie's reformist Independent Labour Party, the forerunner of the modern British Labour Party. By the late 1880s, as he entered the twilight of his life, Engels was becoming more open to the efforts of the Social Democratic Party in Germany, which was making significant progress in the elections to the German Reichstag. Still, he remained committed to communist politics, and in 1889 played a key role in the establishment of the Second International. He engaged in a speaking tour of Europe in the early 1890s, speaking in front of enthusiastic crowds as he journeyed from Zurich to Vienna and thence to Berlin, the capital of the autocratic German Empire, but also a stronghold for the Social Democratic Party. While Engels appeared in fine health during his continental European tour, the work of editing Marx's papers and defending Marxism in socialist congress halls had taken its toll on his health. His eyesight had been deteriorating for several years, and by the beginning of 1895 he was suffering from esophageal cancer. His condition rapidly deteriorated at the end of July, and he died late in the evening of the 5th of August 1895, a few months shy of his 75th birthday. Without any children of his own, he left more than half his estate to Marx's daughters Laura and Eleanor, while appointing the latter as her father's literary executor. In accordance with his will, his remains were cremated and cast out to sea off the south coast of England. Unlike Marx's famous tomb at Highgate, Engels would have no grave or funerary monument. Friedrich Engels leaves behind a complicated legacy. He was one of the most important figures in the history of communism, though he was always being overshadowed within the communist movement by his lifelong collaborator, Karl Marx. Yet Engels was an important figure in his own right. From an early age, he adopted an antagonistic attitude towards his family's capitalist wealth and took his own independent path, though he later reconciled with his father and was happy to live off the proceeds of an industrial company, even while criticizing the economic system which allowed it to thrive. His collaboration with Marx began in the mid-1840s and continued for half a century beyond Marx's own time, with Engels being responsible for editing and finishing the second and third volumes of Marx's Das Kapital in the 1880s and 1890s. The pair are widely known for co-authoring the Communist Manifesto. Though Marx primarily wrote it, it was a distillation of their collective views. However, Engels should not be viewed entirely in the shadow of Marx's work. He was a formidable writer and social critic in his own right. In particular, The Social Condition of the Working Class in England, written by Engels when he was still a young man in his early to mid-20s, is considered today as a classic account of the effects of industrialization on England in the middle of the 19th century, regardless of how one perceives Engels' wider politics. There is no denying that given the crimes of the communist regimes of the 20th century, that Engels and Marx are both controversial figures in many ways. But at the same time, Engels should not merely be viewed as an editor of Marx's work or a sidekick of some kind, but rather as a substantial political writer in his own right. What do you think of Friedrich Engels? Was he an effective critic of industrial capitalism, whose contributions to communist ideology were as impactful as those of Karl Marx, or does he share responsibility for the brutality and bloodshed that accompanied the communist dictatorships of the 20th century in Europe and further afield? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.